the session one of the discussion of the conference, and it's taking topic Global Economic Landscape, Implementations of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and Key Issues in International Taxations for ASEAN Plus 3.
Yeah. And I would like to invite our panelists for this session to come up to the stage. And Her Excellency, Minister of Finance, Republic of Indonesia, Mrs. Sri Mulyani Indrawati, please. Her Excellency, Senior Minister of State for Law and Finance, Singapore, Ms. Indrani Raja, please. His Excellency, Minister of Finance, the Second Malaysia, Mr. Datuk Johari bin Abdul Ghani, please. The Honourable former Deputy Prime Minister and Federal Treasurer Australia, Mr. Wayne Swan, please. His Excellency, Mr. Yo Il-ho, former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Strategy and Finance Korea, please. And our moderator for this session is Executive Producers, Presenter from Channel News Asia. I would like to invite Ms. Lynn Trilling to come up to the stage, please. And our speaker for this session is Director, Fiscal Affairs Department from IMF. I would like to invite Mr. Vitor Gaspar to come up to the podium and to deliver the introduction for this session. Mr. Vitor and Ms. Lynn, I hand over this session to both of you.
So it's a pleasure, it's an honor, it's a privilege to address you in this session one of this international tax conference. I'm humbled by this opportunity because I will be making my intervention between the introductions by the Deputy Managing Director Furuzawa and Minister Sri Mulyani, and before a discussion by this very distinguished panel. I want to start by thanking the Indonesian Ministry of Finance for this wonderful partnership in organizing this international tax conference that marks an important stage in our voyage to Indonesia. The only thing that I can say to keep you interested is to promise that I will be short. I will be giving you my takeaways right at the beginning, so you can interrupt me and tell me to shut up at any time. So what are the takeaways? First of all, fiscal policy is globally very important. Fiscal policy is important all over the world. That's very important context, I believe, for this conference. We are very much emphasizing that fiscal policy is structural policy. Fiscal policy is important for inclusive growth and development. Among fiscal policy, tax policy is particularly important. Tax policy, as emphasized by both Furuzawa and Sri Mulyani, is crucial as a determinant for state capacity. Hence, for a state to fulfill its role in the process of growth and development, tax capacity is a key ingredient. And that is something which is very much emphasized in IMF research. Tax policy is important when countries are trying to push outwards the technological frontier. Tax policy is important to enable firms to catch up to the technological frontier. And in order for tax policy to be able to fulfill its domestic national role, a sound and fair international tax system is important, and for that, we need to have very strong international cooperation. this is it. So I already gave you the outline. So my first topic is the need for tax revenue. And we have seen that the region, the Asian region, is characterized by relatively low tax to GDP ratios. Moreover, as you can see from the slide, the path of tax revenue in the region is very flat. It has been increasing in many countries around the world, but not in the region. And the recent trends are not, in this sense, particularly encouraging. So there is a challenge associated with the mobilization of tax revenue in the region. Now, as you see from this second slide, tax revenues as a share of GDP vary widely across the world. In general, tax revenues are positively correlated with GDP per capita, which basically says that as countries develop, their tax capacity, their ability to collect tax revenue also goes up. The interesting point that I want to stress is that research that I did at the IMF with a couple of colleagues, Laura Jaramillo and Philippe Vingender, shows that when tax capacity reaches a number that we interpret for policy purposes as being 15% of GDP, typically there is an associated acceleration in growth. That basically means that there seems to be a minimum in terms of the tax to GDP ratio, which is associated with the ability of the state to fulfill its functions in the process of growth and development. From that viewpoint, the goal of reaching 16% of GDP that was just emphasized by Minister Muliani is exactly appropriate, and it's in line with having a medium to long-term approach to revenue mobilization, which is something which we're pushing as a standard around the world. Now let's move on and look at how tax policy can actually make a difference for the technological frontier and for the ability of firms to catch up with the frontier. So what you see in this slide is that the amount of support, fiscal support for research and development varies widely across the world. Our research has shown that research and development by firms is associated with very important positive externalities on other firms and hence deserves support. But the point that I want you to take away is that the way it is done matters a lot. Our research suggests that patent boxes, for example, are either inefficient, that's what you have in the two up panels on the right-hand side of the slide, or you cannot see in the slide, but you can trust me, in the two cases where patent boxes are efficient, in the two cases where patent boxes are effective, they're not efficient. They do not deliver bang for buck. Okay. Now, let's focus not on the moving of the technological frontier, but on the catching up to the technological frontier. And what you can see from this slide is a theme from Joseph Schumpeter. That is, when you compare the most efficient firms in blue when you compare the distribution of a more efficient country in blue with a less efficient country in yellow, what you see is that the difference between the two is marked by the existence of firms which are far from the frontier. That is, inefficient firms. There is a relatively strong number of firms that are relatively unproductive. If tax policy allows this misallocation of resources to diminish, then one can get substantially better aggregate results. And tax policy can do that, and by doing so, can increase growth by about 1 percentage point per year, which is a very large number. How can tax policy do this? It can do this by being neutral policy that does not discriminate across asset types, across means of financing, and across types of firms. For example, discriminating firms in accordance with their size. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Our research published in the last fiscal monitor shows that when countries support small firms, they do so at a very large cost. What is this cost? The cost is shown in this slide. When you compare the red, the average growth of firms when there is small firm support, and the blue, countries where there is no such support, what you see is that for countries that do not discriminate, firms grow much faster. And since with firm growth, there is growth of productivity, the fact that you have neutral policy leads to considerably better macroeconomic results in terms of growth and productivity growth. Last slide, topic of this conference, international taxation. International taxation matters a lot for reasons that Furuzawa-san and Sri Mulyani very much emphasized. For my own purposes, what I would like you all to recall is that the intellectual basis for the system of international taxation that we now have is more than 100 years old. And most things, even the most resilient things, do depreciate over 100 years. And so rethinking the international tax system, which is the topic of this conference, is something which is very much called for. And as promised, since I gave you the conclusions at the beginning, I will not conclude. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, my most distinguished panel, and of course, all of you very distinguished guests. My name is Lynn Trilling. I'm from Channel News Asia. We are a network based in Singapore, but we are actually, our 70 million viewers are all over Asia, in fact, very strongly in ASEAN. This particular panel is live webcast, both on the IMF as well as the Indonesian Finance Ministry's website. And it's a very digital panel, so I would ask all of you to join in the conversation. We actually have a hashtag, which is #AsiaGrowth. And while I would ask you to please keep your telephones on silent mode, we're very happy for you to live tweet. This conference is one which is a very inclusive one, as Mrs. Srimulyani has already mentioned. Perhaps we ought to have had a different title for it. Instead of the International Tax Conference, we could have actually called it the Sense of Justice Conference, because isn't that what really tax is all about? It's related to our sense of balance and our sense of justice. So I'm going to kick off this session with a question to Srimulyani herself, and that is to ask whether or not you can actually achieve this balance of attracting investment and yet, at the same time, be able to maintain your tax base. So in short, is she really going to be able to get her 16% tax to GDP ratio while still having investors want to invest in Indonesia? Srimulyani.
Thank you very much. This is not an easy. I have to do something.
Check something.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a very important question with the statement that we would like to increase our tax to GDP ratio to 16%, but at the same time, the government in this case is also aiming for a higher growth, better quality of growth. First, I think if we are doing it through, in order to collect more tax, you try to increase the rate, and in this case, harassing all the taxpayers in Indonesia, that's definitely a trade-off. Because you couldn't, in this case, even when I announced that we are aiming for a high tax to GDP ratio, I've already created an alarming signal to many of the taxpayers in Indonesia, and especially for the investors. And that's why we really have to do it very carefully, by saying that many of them is the tax collection in Indonesia is low because of, first, there are quite a lot of loopholes, both in terms of the policy weaknesses. We have VAT, but we have so many exemptions that it's becoming too complicated and too impossible to administer. And that's create quite a lot of loophole and abuse, including, in this case, that by some company who actually using the VAT in order for them to get revenue from the government rather than paying tax to the government. I think that is already being known by many of the VAT regime all over the world. That, the second one is we have to improve through the administration. I mean, many of the complaints by the taxpayer in Indonesia is that there are quite a lot of the random and standard approach by our tax officers when we are dealing with the taxpayer. For example, if they are coming with a company and they say that they are obliged to pay a certain level of tax, our team should be able to come up with the question about where the data are coming from, how you will be able to come up with a certain level of obligation, which is maybe different from what the company or the individual is reporting. And that's why the tax amnesty is actually very important for us. The data which is showing 4,000 trillion rupiah asset disclosed. 1/4 is abroad, 3/4 is domestic. It's showing how many and how much is actually asset which is in the past can be easily avoided from the taxpayers, by the taxpayer to pay their obligation. That shows there are so many weaknesses within the administration. So reform is important by improving the way we work, the business process. We even have to invest in the IT system and database system. Because I sometimes jokingly here in Indonesia, you don't even have to avoid to go outside Indonesia. You just go outer island of Java, or outer provincial of Jakarta. You can avoid tax. Why? Because the database is not consolidated. You can easily evade by saying that my operation is in Kalimantan and the headquarters in Jakarta, and they're not necessarily a way to consolidate and verify the data. So improvement internally is very important. And by improving the governance, business process, certainty of the data, it will create much more confidence of the taxpayer that they are going to be treated better by our tax officers. If I improve the governance and making sure that you are no longer making a business of tax collection outside the office hour, all the meetings should be in the office with the CCTV, so I know what the conversation is. It's actually creating a much better, because many of the company or even individual, they actually saying that I'm willing to pay tax, but what I cannot handle is the uncertainty. The uncertainty about their behavior, uncertainty about how much that I actually the obligation to pay tax and so on. So that is actually have a room for us, given, as I said earlier, that our tax to GDP ratio is still very low. I'm sure a lot of them have something to do with the reform internally for Indonesia. But it doesn't also hide the fact that for Indonesia, especially big company, is also easily evade tax to go to our neighboring country. And that is something that we cannot collect easily. And because in Indonesia, a study by the World Bank saying that 1% rich in Indonesia actually controlling more than 50% of the asset in Indonesia, meaning that this is create huge distortion for the Indonesia in terms of equality, the sense of justice and equality. And that is exactly what we are really now feels, that when Indonesia really need to invest more on the infrastructure, human capital in order for us to be able to be more productive and competitive, then we should be able to also have a global cooperation to prevent this tax evasion and tax avoidance.
Thank you, Sri Mulyani. You've brought up several points though, Mrs. Sri Mulyani, both in terms of tax competition as well as corporate taxation, where companies can go to. Let me ask Mr. Swan, Australia is now in the process of lowering its corporate tax rate. You're making yourself more attractive to foreign investors. Do you worry though that you're eroding your tax base?
I think it's the wrong thing to do. The destruction of progressive tax bases, particularly company income taxation, lies at the core of the rampant income and wealth inequality that we are seeing around the world, particularly in the United States and other developed economies. I would hate to see an economy like Indonesia make the same mistakes that have been made across the developed world, where tax bases which are efficient and tax bases which are equitable have been destroyed in the name of trickle-down economics. It's been bad for growth, and it's led to polarisation in society. And Exhibit A there is Donald Trump. So I welcome Sri Mulyani's sense of justice, because that's where a discussion about tax must begin.
Mr. Yu, what do you think? Is this tax to GDP ratio of 15% that magic balance?
Even that 15%, did you say?
Tax to GDP ratio.
Yes,
what's
it's
the balance point?
Yeah, it's
the tipping point.
Actually, it is 19.4% last year, which was the highest in the Korean history, I guess. Formerly, it was 19.3%. Our tax to GDP ratio has been around 17 to high 18% these days. Well, in the past, like Indonesia, it is even lower than 10%, 30 or 40 years ago. Anyway, about the increase, like many others said, that increase the tax base or broaden the tax base is very important, and that's our key policy these days. To increase the tax revenue, we have to broaden the tax base. And we, I believe, have succeeded somewhat on that point. Say, for example, reducing the size of the so-called underground or black economy, or tax evasion, or and so on and so on. We have succeeded on that part. So we certainly have some success, I should say, that broadening the tax base so far these days. But increasing the tax revenue per se cannot be the objective of the policy, because it's say appropriate tax to GDP ratio might differ from countries to countries. So in Korea now, if we want to really increase the tax revenue, then probably we want to introduce new tax or increase the tax rate somewhere. We don't do this. Rather, we are focusing on the broadening the tax base. And so far, that has been partially successful, I believe.
Datuk, what do you think in the case of Malaysia?
Well, as you notice, I think we have improved our tax regime over last 10 years. Today, if you look at Malaysia, our tax revenue is approximately between 17% to GDP. Now, what worried me now is not so much of how much more you want to collect. What I'm concerned now is actually looking at the new economy activities that relate to a digital economy, e-commerce, for example. These are an economy that slowly and surely getting bigger and bigger in a country like ours. I'll give you an example. 10 years ago, you hardly see an e-commerce activities or digital economy in our country that hardly you can see even 1%. Today, if you look at our GDP of 300 billion US dollar, 18% of that is contributed from the digital economy, e-commerce, and also this digital economy. And I'll give you an example like, 10 years ago, you will never see business activities like taxi, for example. You have a company like Uber, become the big player of taxi in the taxi industry, but it doesn't own the taxi, right? And you look at hotel players like Airbnb. They don't even own a single hotel. And yet, you look at, they are actually selling in hotel rooms, almost about 4 million hotel rooms in the world. Now, these are kind of activities that I'm always concerned, how within us in this region, how do we come up with a tax policy that's regionally acceptable by all these players in the digital and e-commerce or e-economy activities, that all of us here will have a kind of a protection in terms of our revenue base as a country. So I think this is key, and especially when you look at even some of the OECD countries, they are now having a problem because their tax system is not responsive enough to address this kind of new economy activities that emerging into in the world.
Ms. Indrani Raja, what do you think? Do you agree that policymakers are not dynamic enough to adjust to the new e-commerce world?
I think that really you have to take the world as it is. Economies have been growing, developing, changing, and obviously you cannot stay still. In the case of Singapore, we've tried to maintain some consistent principles even as the world around us, grows and develops, which is really that our tax system is pro-growth and progressive. At the same time, we want to be internationally competitive, but you also have to have a broad base for taxes. I mean, it's not just corporate tax. You need to have other sources of tax, property tax, income tax, and you want to keep it broad-based. At the same time, tax is not the only thing. If you want to encourage investment, you need to have a stable environment. You need to make sure there's low corruption. You've got to have a very pro-business environment. So it's all of these things which come together, and we try very hard to strike that balance.
Mr. Gaspar, now, with all the numbers, does it bear out, actually? Are we able to find that sort of magic point where countries can be competitive, where they can still attract investment, and yet, on the other hand, have a strong, good tax base so that it allows them to do all the things for education, healthcare, defense that we need to do?
Yes. There are very important complementarities between taxation and other functions of government that we are starting to understand at a deeper level. Tax matters a lot and it's different from other sources of revenue that the states use because it is a stable source of revenue, and if tax capacity has been developed, it's also elastic in the sense that it can increase in case there's a need to increase coming from some natural disaster, some financial crisis, some other aspect. Tax is associated with institutional development. And people in the panel have already clearly hinted of why that is so. First of all, because tax capacity requires quasi-voluntary compliance on the part of the taxpayer. And taxpayers are only going to comply with the tax law voluntarily if they perceive it as fair and fairly enforced, which is an issue of revenue administration. Secondly, and equally important, in order for people to pay their taxes voluntarily, they have to be convinced that the resources are being well used. So, with fair taxation comes a demand for accountability of government, and that's important for investment to be efficient, for the education system to be inclusive, for the health system to be efficient, and so on and so forth.
Well, I'll pick up again on another thing that Mrs. Srimulyani mentioned, and that is the IMF has found also that fiscal structure reforms to reduce efficiency loss could actually give you a 1 percentage point boost to GDP growth. So if it is such that we could, by efficiency reforms, actually improve our GDP growth by 1 percentage point, are all of our countries in Asia doing that? Why is it so difficult? Do we need to have CCTVs in every room whenever you have a tax audit? So what's the problem? Why is it we're not able to tap into and grab that 1 percentage point GDP growth? Why are we stuck?
Well, if I may, in this case, saying that the administrative reform is very important doesn't mean that it's easy to do. And the administration reform doesn't only needs that, oh, okay, you are going to have a new law, and then immediately after that it can be implemented. There is quite a lot. I've been in the same position 10 years ago. When you talk about reform, you actually really change, as Vitor mentioned, from the taxpayer, but also from the tax officers. And the tax officers means that the attitude, the mindset, the way they see it, and they conduct their responsibility is actually something which is telling quite a lot about what you call it governance and capacity. Governance is something which is not easily that, oh, okay, tomorrow no longer corruption. That's maybe one thing, but you can have a clean but not effective institution. I mean, you can be, oh, I'm not corrupt, but I'm not collecting tax, so what? I mean, that is really something that really you change the value, capacity, leadership, the administrative capacity, so that they become an effective institution. That takes time. And also sometimes a battle between, oh, is this reform this time really mean it? Or we just wait until the minister is going to be reshuffled and then maybe we will have another minister, something like that. Or maybe we will wait until this regime gone and then maybe we are going to the old way of doing business. So these are all something, what you call it, the credibility game. Something that you really need to lead along the way every day, just like you are going to like, what you call it, growing the value. Some country like Singapore today may be taken for granted what late Lee Kuan Yew has already did in the past. So when you talk about good governance, it seems like, oh, it's already way of life. For a country who's been perceived that we have a lot of corruption, really telling with the credibility internally and externally that we are really moving to the new way of doing business will take quite a lot. But some of the approach can help. IT, the information technology, is very important. You can actually separate it between front office, middle office, back office. We actually try to collect all the large taxpayer office into one office so that we can scrutinize and can have much better risk portfolio. You actually can also change the way we work. As I said also, database information technology is going to create certainty both internally as well as for the taxpayer. So a lot of things that need to be done, but of course, like in the IMF or World Bank study paper, they can say that do this reform, 1% of gross, you will get it. It's easy, but implement it, the how is something that we really need to do country by country.
Oh, I think she hit you there, Mr. Gaspar. Mr. Swan, what do you think? Easy to talk about, but actually very difficult to claw in that 1%.
Well, I agree that tax policy is a big structural reform, and all big structural reforms require strong public support. And you can be sure when you put a big tax change on the table, there'll be plenty of powerful vested interests that will decide they're going to lose in the short term and in the long term. So I think you've got to talk about how you garner public support. It is as important as the design of the tax itself. One thing we did in Australia was we passed some transparency legislation, which for all of our largest companies, we supplied total income, taxable income, and tax paid. All of a sudden, everybody could see that there were many companies not paying much tax who appeared to be otherwise very profitable. Now, on some occasions, there are reasons why they were not paying tax. But what it shone a light on was that the disreputable behaviour of respectable corporates in Australia who had claimed publicly they were paying their fair share, but clearly engaged in transfer pricing and debt dumping to the extent that it was eroding our revenue substantially. That paved the way for further reforms because the public could understand that these people were tax termites, that they shouldn't be believed when they claimed that the national interest was not served by law changes dealing with transfer pricing. So what's really important in every structural reform, be it carbon or tax, is to pave the way with the public as to the need for the reform and why should there be a reform, and not to create the impression that an increase in the tax to GDP ratio is an end in itself. If you do that, you'll lose. The purpose of it has to be paramount, and it has to be seen to be fair. And you can't be seen to be fair if wealthy individuals and large corporates aren't paying their fair share. And that takes us to international tax, but I'll stop there.
Dato, Malaysia, of course, has been implementing GST changes
Yes.
as well. That is, as you say, trying to get the public to buy into this
Correct.
as well.
If you look at, in our case, prior to 2015, we are on a sales tax regime. We implement GST somewhere in April 2015. From there onward, we can see this tax reform that we have made have given us an additional about 2 to 3% of additional revenue from our tax. Very efficient. But then again, what Sri Rani was saying just now, that having a good tax system is one thing, but what is the best method of you implementing it? For example, like, in the case of GST, you have a standard rate, and then after that you have exempt tax products, and then you have zero tax product. These are too many variables that may result in very difficult for you to do enforcement, because you will see, your enforcement costs getting higher and higher, while you are trying to trace the accuracy of that GST standard rates with exempt or zero tax rate. Now, I'm trying to look at a scenario where, assuming that currently we are charging 6% GST, and we also allow zero tax and exempt tax. What happens, we cancel off zero and exempt tax, but we reduce the GST tax to maybe from 6 to 5 or 4 or 4%, and you charge across business activities. And therefore, you will save a lot of enforcement costs, compliance is getting better, and then you bring everybody into the system, and you bring the formal and informal to be together, And then thus, you will be able to reduce a black economy or shadow economy very significantly in that, in your country.
I'm now going to ask our distinguished guests here what they think. If I were to ask you that, do you believe that greater efficiency, we're not even talking about good governance, but just greater efficiency in taxation reform, would it be actually able to claw in this supposed 1% increase in GDP growth? Or do you believe that Mr. Gaspar is being very hopeful? Could I have a show of hands? Which of you believe that if you had greater efficiency, you could actually get this additional 1% GDP growth? We have 3 hands in a room of several hundred people. Okay, I'm afraid, Mr. Gaspar, they do not believe you. I will also at this point ask, are there any questions from the floor to the panelists? They will be very happy to take any questions. Okay, no, we can see there's great skepticism, I'm afraid, though. I'll bring it back to the panel now. Tax competition, sticky issue, but we are at international tax. So, Ms. Indrani Raja, of the panelists here, Singapore has the lowest corporate tax rate at 17%. Everyone else hovers around the 20, 24, 25. Are you is Singapore being unfairly low on the corporate tax?
You see, as I mentioned earlier, tax is not the only thing. And you've got to see how you can maintain that balance. You've got corporate tax is one source. You've got other sources. Importantly is, do you have growth? Because you could have a very high tax rate and very low growth, and that doesn't bring in an awful lot of revenue. So you've got to do things in combination. It's for each country to decide what is an appropriate tax rate. But what is very important is that it must be taxed on substantive economic activity that takes place in the jurisdiction. You want to make sure that that happens. You want to make sure that there is good growth so that there is more. And you do have to make sure that it's progressive and fair. So it comes back to what I said earlier. And you can't divorce it from good governance as well. And that is something that Singapore takes very seriously during Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's time, as Sri Mulyani has mentioned, but also now post this time. It's a preoccupation of our government to make sure that you have good governance. I suppose Singapore is small, so it makes things a little easier. Countries which are larger have greater challenges. But you do need to have a system which is efficient and a system which allows you to collect well, and people must see that the taxes are being used in a way that is, that shares the revenue around.
Mr. Gaspar.
There is no tax where the balance between the tax rate and the tax base is more important than corporate income tax. And so one has to take into account both rate and base. But I want, in a sense, to try to help you grasp where the 1% can come from. Let me give you just one example. I spoke that the inefficiencies come from the fact that you don't treat assets, say machinery and structures, or means of financing, say debt versus equity, the same way. Let's just focus on the discrimination that you have in most tax systems in favor of debt. I actually had a slide on that one that I jumped over for the benefit of time. Ruud de Moy, an economist in the Fiscal Affairs Department, and Mick Keen, who is sitting on my right-hand side in the first row, right there, have done wonderful work in which they show that this discrimination in favor of debt in the tax system leads to firms, corporations, in non-financial corporations, but also banks and other financial intermediaries to have higher levels of leverage. That is not only inefficient in terms of the financing mix, but also increases substantially risks to financial stability. And since we are just emerging from the global financial crisis, you can imagine the costs for growth and prosperity associated with financial crisis. And remember, this is just one little element of the tax system as a whole. So I hope that this one argument may have been strong enough to shift the views of some of you at least.
Mr. Swan?
I think there's a big difference between what I would regard as healthy competition and tax policies which plunder the revenue bases of other countries. Now, this can well be in the eye of the beholder, but what we don't need is a race to the bottom on corporate tax, international corporate tax. And some countries do risk being part of that and thereby putting their neighbours in very difficult situations. That's why the BEPS process is very important. But I think countries that are hosting hubs, which are being used for transfer pricing and impacting on countries like Indonesia and Australia, ought to think again about what they're doing. It's good to see that they're now signing up to the BEPS process, but I'd like to see a lot more progress because I think big countries in particular and big markets like Indonesia, Australia and China will have had just about enough of that race to the bottom, particularly if Donald Trump does what he does in the US.
Mr. Yu, yes.
Yeah. Well, let me go back to the domestic tax first. And then like I said, in Korea, we have been partially successful to broaden the tax base by attacking and by reducing the so-called black economy, or underground economy. I guess that one possible reason which makes it possible is so-called digitalization of all these big data is collectible now compared to the past, and then those things will enable us to reduce the tax administrative and compliance costs, as Mr. Abdul Ghani pointed out. And so in that sense, I am not saying that that is the only possible path toward the broadening the tax base and decreasing the inefficiency, as a result, increasing the GDP by 1%. I don't know whether it's truly 1% or I believe you. Anyway, in the same context, if we come to the international taxation area, I think the same logic applies here. That so-called harmful tax competition leads to us the erosion of the tax base. And that's why we are focusing on the BEPS these days. And so in that sense, it is very important for us, and that, like many others say already, the international cooperation is very important. Without it, harmful tax competition cannot be avoided. That's what I would like to say. Thank you.
Okay, so we've done a little bit of the finger pointing. Why don't we now do some of the more constructive, perhaps, collaboration? International tax. Collaboration on a very simple level. Not enough, Mrs. Sri Mulyani? Especially if we look at ASEAN?
Well, if I compare with 10 years ago, definitely today is really a huge progress. And if I a little bit can mention the discussion before, I think I'm expecting the role of the IMF, in this case World Bank, to become an institution who can give a referee about what you call it fair tax practice, because that's important. In the G20 leaders, as already, and finance minister, they are all declared that we are going to avoid race to the bottom. But of course, each of the finance minister, and beyond the G20, Singapore, Malaysia, other, who actually not a member of G20, even Indonesia, we all have to be accountable to our own people. And as Ms. Indrani mentioned, this is all coming up with the goals about growth, employment, and tax rate is something that you really need to calibrate within your own domestic. And each country have their own characteristic. But of course, unintentionally, as Wayne mentioned, some country who actually have their own domestic in their mind of deciding base and rate can actually become disadvantaged for the just immediate country. I will be very blunt and frank here. When I come back to Indonesia, become finance minister, the first 1 month, Many of the business people saying that, Sri-Mulyani, why you're not lowering the tax so that we are going to be at par as Singapore at 17%? And I said, I'm willing to do that as long as my base is going to be triple. I cannot do it when my base is so narrow and I'm declining, and then no one is going to pay tax even more in this case. So first, for a country, especially big country like Indonesia, Wayne mentions Australia, we have much more complication in terms of the way we are going to administer tax and so on. And that's why this international cooperation is important. You mentioned in this case, yes, this time, I must say, a lot of progress, but still a lot of room to improve. This base erosion profit shifting is really wonderful. I never imagined before that all countries will declare that they are going to be part of this system to prevent the base erosion and profit shifting. Because we all know when we in a certain country opening up the economy, we are inviting more foreign direct investment, all these big corporations can easily shifting their profit, do the transfer pricing, and then each of the tax jurisdiction cannot enforce what they call it the fair share of the revenue. I think that's why this kind of cooperation is very essential. Second, automatic exchange of information is even more important, because then you are going to be able, with all the goodwill, that you automatically exchange the information about what, who, how much the taxpayer in your jurisdiction, which is not belong to you, but it's belong to other country. And that will really, this kind of signal will provide a very credible signal to the taxpayer that no matter where you are going to hide your asset, people or authority is going to find you. If that signal is so credible, then the collection cost is going to be much lower and easier. I think that is very critical, and that's why I'm actually very hopeful that all this cooperation is going to be strengthened again and again. It's not one country implementation at the cost of other. It's just creating what we call it the global system, which is fair. I don't think no one, even any president of any biggest powerful country in the world, can defend globalization if we are not going to be able to improve the fairness and the inclusiveness of this economy globally.
Mr. Gaspar is dying to come in here.
Because I found your comment very constructive and optimistic, and I have one other comment which I believe is also very constructive and optimistic to offer. Most of you in the panel, perhaps all of you, have mentioned digitalization as a challenge, and you have mentioned new platforms as transforming business in a way which is a challenge to the tax administration. The optimistic point that I want to make is that there are very strong possibilities associated with digitalization as well. And those possibilities have to do with using digital technology and information in the service of tax administration. Just think, platforms work based on scale and scope. Platforms are networks. A rule of thumb is that the value of a platform increases with the square of the people connected to it. So you don't have small platforms. They're always large. They're always visible. Their business is creating and processing information. Hence, they're at least conceptually easy to monitor. And they can, with adequate partnerships with the tax administration, be very good partners in the enforcement of taxation. This is part of a process that we in the fund call digital revolutions in public finance. By embracing digitalization, the public administrations around the world can change the game, and in this particular case, doing exactly what you were calling for, making sure that taxation is more effective, more neutral, and it's more fair.
Could I just add something in on the international collaboration? I think international collaboration is something that we fully support, and Singapore is very supportive of the BEPS project. Most importantly, we support the key principle which underlies the BEPS project, and that is really that profits should be taxed where the real economic activities generating the profits are performed and where the value is created. And that is irrespective of what sector or what industry it is. But I wish to reiterate that as a very strong principle because that really underlies the basis of the whole BEPS thrust. And to that end, we've committed to the implementation of the BEPS minimum standards. We've also signed up for the Multilateral Competent Authority Agreement, both for the country-by-country reporting, which is really aimed at dealing with transfer pricing, as well as for the Common Reporting Standard and the automatic exchange of information, and also the MLI. And we've also participated in the OECD Forum on the harmful practices reviews on tax incentives. So I think we would want to encourage other countries to come on board for the BEPS inclusive framework and the various implementation plans, because we think that that is beneficial for the international tax community as a whole.
Yes, Lynn, yeah. I certainly agree about these international collaborations. I'll give you an example, like for example in the case of Malaysia. We host quite a number of business activity in our countries, but because we are neighboring with Singapore and Thailand, Malaysia have a corporate tax of 24%. Singapore has 17% and Thailand have 20%. So you imagine, if we don't have this kind of understanding or collaboration among the countries, we were going to be the victims of BEPS. When people use the profit to be shifted to another country by operating in the countries like us. And that's where I always subscribe and insist that all countries in this region should be a signatory to the automatic exchange of information. Very, very key. And then all of us must also be in a comprehensive double tax agreement, DTA. All of us must have that, comprehensive, not selective. It has to be comprehensive. Because once it's comprehensive, even though they do the invoicing in Singapore, for example, and the product is produced in Malaysia, and you can enjoy a 17%, but because I have a comprehensive DTA, so I still have entitled to tax the difference because of that DTA. But if you don't have that DTA, it's going to be very difficult. So Malaysia, in Malaysia case, we have signed almost about 74 countries in the world. But we don't have a comprehensive tax system with US, for example. And we try to have that, but we are not successful. And they are capital exporting countries. When they are capital exporting countries, you invest in our country, you bring your capital, you start charging all these interest costs, capital costs. We are not able to put a withholding tax against you because we don't have this kind of a tax agreement. And when we start charging, and they're saying that, we change our rules. So this is where, if we want to be a level playing field, it's only fair, every countries that want to trade to the respective countries, we must have this kind of TTA and AEOI in place so that everyone will benefit at the end of the day.
Ms. Indrani Raja, what would you say to what Dato has said?
In which particular respect?
Well, this is about basically the difficulty of, as you say, where is the activity taking place? When it's invoiced, when it's exported, all of these questions, it becomes rather complicated and conflated.
These are some of the things which are addressed really in the BEPS action plans, and that is the reason why we support the BEPS project. But the important thing is you must do it in an international framework where everybody is acting in accordance with the same standards. What you don't want is unilateral action or a different way of doing things because it makes it very difficult for businesses. So in our case, as I said, we've signed up to the 2 MCAAs, one for the country-by-country reporting and the other for the Common Reporting Standard, which will certainly, I think, be very useful for all the other partner countries as well.
Mr. Gaspar?
On this one, the crucial thing is the point that was made by both, that is, the approach should be international and cooperative, and unilateral action should be avoided as much as possible because it has important spillover effects on other countries, and international cooperation is indeed necessary to curb international tax competition.
Doesn't this discussion just demonstrate why we need a regional body which is talking about tax administration? For example, there are something like 3 separate regional bodies when it comes to tax administration. Many of them are doing very good work, dealing with digital issues and others. But if this discussion really demonstrates to me that there is a strong desire for a more informed discussion, not just about tax administration, but the broader questions of how we tax and why we tax. And if we're going to be successful as politicians, we've all got an interest in ensuring the revenue is adequate. So if we have a more mature discussion at a regional level on both policy and administration, we might be able to avoid the race to the bottom, which nobody wins.
But isn't the difficulty saying that you keep creating new bodies, but actually nothing gets decided?
Well,
do we really need more regional bodies?
Well, there needs to be a discussion about tax, and it needs to be focused. There's a body that does this for Africa. There's a body that does this for South America. We have 3 separate administration bodies in the region. They're not connected.
Can I take it round the panelists? Do we need another body that would actually, as Mr. Swan suggests, do the real work, do the real coordination?
It's really hard to tell. Do we need another body to administer all these things? Maybe. To be honest, I don't have the answer for that. So as we all know, we should again be reminded that why do we talk about these international taxation issues and international tax cooperation? So simply the reality is still, as we can see here today, that there's a difference, and we all try to depend upon the tax incentives to attract the foreign investment, not just foreign or domestic, whatever investment. And then that's the reality, and that's if that's over the limit, then we begin to talk about this, and then the tax cooperation. So that's the reality, and that's why we need this cooperation, and that's important. And also, as I said, do we have the real right answer, which is most powerful, that can resolve all these issues altogether? No, to be honest. And
no
creating a body, maybe one solution, but I guess it is a part of the solution, I think.
Dato', do you think we need another regional body?
Well, I still think that we don't need at this moment. What we need is that we're trying to leverage against the experience that we see some of the regional bodies like OECD, IMF, World Bank. These are all established bodies that we can sit down and collaborate, and in as far as ASEAN is concerned, we can always use ASEAN platform to discuss and collaborate and exchange a kind of method, strategy with all these institutions so that we get the best method to standardize this kind of tax issues among us, especially in this region.
I think that's a fair point raised by Dato', which is that I'm not sure it's necessary to have a new body, but there's certainly much room and scope for regional cooperation and dialogue, and we should leverage on the existing platforms where a lot of tremendous work has been done by the OECD and the Global Forum. So we would certainly encourage ASEAN members to join the Global Forum, to join the BEPS Inclusive Framework, as well as also to sign and ratify the Multilateral Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters.
Mrs. Srimulyani, do you think another regional body is necessary?
I think the OECD Global Forum is quite effective as of today in implementing. And besides, if it is regional, the tax practice is not regional. I mean, many of the countries actually have the MNC, which is not only among the ASEAN 10. They actually headquarter, or if you talk about tax jurisdiction, which has become a tax haven, tax evasion place, is actually outside the ASEAN 10. So regional definitely will not answer the issue, but it's really more a global, because they actually can go from region to region in a way. And Global Forum is the initiative which is already being made. Can I add one more to what is being discussed about this fairness and level playing field? When we talk about level playing field, we have to also be very mindful that all country is not at the same level playing field. So when everybody using the level playing field as a way to actually try to implement a certain policy, which is not necessarily just really want genuinely to create level playing field, but really to delay a certain adjustment that need to be done. That can be also be actually, it's not level playing field. So for example, what Dato Johar mentioned in this case, if you talk about rate, we have 17, we have 20, we have 24, I have 25. Then definitely, if you talk about 5, then Indonesia is maybe the most disadvantaged in this case. And if talk about level playing field, or Indrani mentioned about tax on your profit, we can debate a lot in this case on what you call it the level and what is fairness in this case. So I think the most important in this case, when the momentum of the international tax cooperation is here, then every tax authority should be able to also be very open and honest about whether their practice today or in the past is actually fair. And then when you are talking about playing field today, is actually also fair for the today and future in this case, that will correct what is in the past, is not level playing field. Because then it is actually with that kind of intention that is going to be able to create what you call it credibility of this cooperation. And that is very important. IMF, World Bank, OECD should be able to answer this kind of question. When we talk about SDG, because we are talking, Furuzawa-san mentioned in the opening, when everybody talk about how we are going to create a global world in which everybody can share the prosperity, this cannot be done by a certain region, certain part of people can take advantage of others. We are talking about all this as the development goal, which is actually shared by all countries in the world. And that can only be done when the domestic resource mobilization can be effectively implemented. And we all know about those domestic resource mobilization means a lot. They cannot be done individually. It should be done also globally. So Indonesia definitely is going to ready to play its part. Both domestically, we will try to deepen our reform, but we will not shy in saying that globally or regionally, if we see there is unfair practice, we will saying it. And we want the international mechanism to correct that, because this is not serving the need of Indonesia. I genuinely believe that this will serve better for the new global community.
Mr. Gaspar?
So I very much agree. I think that you're absolutely right, Sri Mulyani, when you emphasize that global tax requires a global approach. And I think that's spot on. That's why the initiatives of the OECD in the context of the Global Forum and BEPS are so central and are so important to discuss wider issues of tax policy and tax administration. We have the platform for cooperation on tax that involves, on top of the OECD, the IMF and the World Bank, and Furuzawa-san did mention the platform. When we look at this idea of a level playing field, I believe, but I would like to see if you agree or not, that what we mean is that business decisions on investment and employment should be driven by economic fundamentals and not taxation. That's the bottom line.
That's not the way the corporate work, Vitor. Yeah, well, that's why you have to be like, this is really something that needs to be discussed. At the corporate level, the company is not going to make decisions not only based on the fundamental, they will look at the rate as one of the part. I mean, we as a finance minister, every day, every time we meet the taxpayer or the potential investor, they definitely is going to mention that, well, you know what, Indonesia is so attractive and I believe in you, but you know your rate is just too high. I mean, that's the fact of life that we have to face every day. So, like it or not, and that's why everybody said there is really the term of race to the bottom is really real for us. And as much as really we want to have those kind of behavior and adjustment at the corporate micro level, but that is exactly the fact of life. And that's why as a policymaker, we also know that this is really something that we really need to address. As I said, for a country, I think as a responsible country, I will say that anything within my control, I want to reform. Deep, ambitious, yes. But anything which really require regional and global cooperation, I will not shy to ask the international community to do and to act also consistently, to try to fix this one. Yeah?
Sri, you are not alone.
Oh, no, of course not. That's why we have all the Minister of Finance. I mean, all of you have all your problem in this case.
I would challenge the panel, though, that isn't this all, we talk about the collaboration, at least superficially, we all seem to agree that collaboration is necessary on the issues of tax, but isn't it being rather idealistic? The truth of the matter is that the global community can't even agree now to regional trade deals anymore, much less multilateral ones. So are we not being perhaps a bit blue-eyed when we say that we would like to have agreements on tax, which is so sensitive and has got so many, infused with so many local and domestic and regional feelings?
Well, it shouldn't be too difficult just to get all our tax commissioners together to talk about common problems across the Asia-Pacific. I mean, after all, the Asia-Pacific is driving the global economy, but we don't even have a body where all our tax commissioners sit down together and have a talk about the challenges of the digital economy or what's happening and what's coming up. So it's not an extra body. You could get rid of two and have one.
Okay, I think we've reached the point that I would just throw it one more time open to the floor. Is there anybody who would like to pose a question? Okay, then I will just ask one more time for a quick sort of show of hands poll. Do you think that it will be possible to resolve these various tax questions via cooperation and collaboration, or do you belong to the more cynical who believe that actually, I'm afraid, individual countries tend to be rather protective? Don't worry, this is an off-the-record poll. So, show of hands. Do you belong to the idealistic group? We can solve these problems by cooperation. Yes, I think there is a good 50%, perhaps a little bit more, who belong to the hopeful group. And on that, I would like to do a final roundup with each of my excellent panelists. This is the digital age, so we are live tweeting. 140 characters, but I will not actually keep you to that. But if final thoughts round the panel, starting with Mr. Yu, please.
Well, beginning of the final. As the last vote reveals that we believe in this some say ultimate goal of idealistic goal, and I think we can reach some say practically saying in between of this reality, the miserable reality and the ideal. In between we can reach, I guess, and so we have to. One thing clear is that without this cooperation, we cannot resolve anything. We cannot avoid this problem. So that we have to do it, and that might be too idealistic, but we have to do it. And I believe that, as you saw in my raising hands, I believe that at least we can achieve above the half of those goals. And again, we can have some more tools, which is already pointed out by many others, including myself, that the digitalization, that's one possible powerful source of our, say, the way to cooperation, so that if we work together, then we can achieve some better outcomes on this issue, I believe.
I think what matters is not so much how much tax you raise, but how you raise it, and what is the most efficient and what is the most equitable. The problem we've had in recent years is that the mix of tax has gone from being progressive to being regressive. That has become a drag on growth globally and in some countries. And the IMF has proved this, I think, pretty conclusively, that a progressive mix of tax is not only good for growth, it's also good for society. And when we're seeing the polarisation that we are seeing across developed countries, having a reinvigorated debate about how a progressive tax system drives growth, lifts living standards, is absolutely what we need if we're going to be any hope in hell of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. If we don't fix our revenue systems, there won't be any progress on the Sustainable Development Goals.
Lynn, mine is very short, but I want to see, going forward, that a country in this region will basically become the signatory for BEPS, AEOI, as well as a comprehensive DTA agreement with all the countries that we are dealing with. That is my last parting word.
Well, I'm going to share the last tone in which we are very optimistic that under the current environment, the recognition that international cooperation on taxation is very, very important. And it is really up to all of us to actually strengthen this cooperation. But we are not in the situation like 10 years ago. So this is really good momentum. But as I said, on this cooperation to be credible and really effective in addressing the issue of effective taxation, addressing the issue of fairness and justice within and across country, I think each jurisdiction has their own homework. So anything under your control, you have to do it ambitiously. But anything that requires cooperation, I think we have to be open, more transparent, and frank to each other. And then you are going to say the institution like IMF, World Bank, OECD to be able to provide a better perspective when a country in a dispute, in this case, about what does it mean to be fair to each other.
I think it's all about the right balance. You obviously have the principle of sovereignty. You've got to make sure that you're progressive, fair, transparent, and to the extent that there are differences, these should be talked about and worked through, and international collaboration is definitely the way to go.
Mr. Gaspar, you get the last word.
Oh, that's hard, but let me try. So I think we all agree that tax matters for growth and for inclusion. We all agree that countries can do a lot to make progress in these dimensions. We also, I believe, all agree that there is a very strong case for global cooperation on tax, and we must have the courage to act on that together.
Okay, that was your final tweet. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being such excellent listeners and considering all the various arguments. And thank you to my wonderful panel. And now I will ask you not to stand up immediately because I think that there's going to be a photo. So thank you very much for all attending this session.
Please give a warm applause for the speakers, moderators, and panelists of Session 1. We believe all of us enjoyed the insightful session.
Yes, definitely. And I would like to invite panelists, speakers, and moderator for the first session to come down from the stage for a group photo session. And I would like to invite to join in these photo sessions Mr. Mitsuhiro Furusawa, please. His Excellency Ambassador of Canada to Indonesia, please. His Excellency Ambassador of Singapore to Indonesia, please. Honorable Mr. Muhammad Misbakun, Member of the Republic of Indonesia House of Representatives, please. Senior officials, Echelon 1 from Ministry of Finance and Executive Director of IMF, Mr. Juda Agung. eselon 1 kita. I would like to invite senior officials and or Eselon 1 from Ministry of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia to join to come up to the stage for a photo session.
And we invite also medias to take pictures. And
Okay.
thank you very much. And to all our guests, we will have a 10 minutes coffee break before we start.